So good evening. I'll be discussing our athletic self-study process with a focus on the results of our survey and the next steps. The process to review our athletics programming has been extensive over the past 2 school years. Brian committed publicly to reviewing our athletics at Valley during the 1920 school year, but with COVID and all that came with that, some of the process was delayed. However, we did convene a fields and grounds committee, including parents, board members, administration, and coaches to review our facilities and develop proposals for improvement. This school year, we convened an athletics committee with administration and board members a number of times. We also sent a survey, which will be the bulk of the presentation this evening. Mike and Jeff Swan met with Booster Club presidents recently to review policies and procedures, and we will have our first athletic self-study review team meeting on November 18th. So there's been a lot of steps over the past couple of years to really look at our athletics programming. On September 17th, I sent a survey out to parents, students, and coaches that was modeled off of a CIAC athletic standards review. We added questions specific to concerns that had been noted at Valley in addition to the questions that CIAC developed. The questions included basic demographics, including town, gender, sport, and level of play, varsity or JV. And then it had a number of Likert scale questions, so strongly agree to strongly disagree, that were divided into 5 categories: programming, personnel, communication, equity, and financial support, and comment sections after each, as well as a general comment section at the end of the survey. For the coaches survey, we had 17 responses, which represents 39% of our coaching staff. For the student survey, we had 90 responses, representing 26% of our student athlete population. And for the parent survey, we had 137 responses, which represents 25% of all households in the school. The next slides will include summary graphs for each category, and as well as some sample questions representing the category. And then there's individual questions after each category slide. And those really relate to some specific concerns that have come up, so to show the perception of the community regarding those specific questions. So first, the one demographic question that I wanted to highlight was, does your student intend to participate in their sport after high school? And again, all of these graphs will be percentage for the y-axis, just because of the difference in responses. And so 25 to 35% of students and parents indicated that their student intends to participate in the sport as an NCAA athlete. So that's a pretty high percentage of our athlete population that does want to continue. And then there's other options as part of the club team or as part of an intramural team or rec league. So we do have a majority of our students who do want to continue in their sport. For the programming category overall, it was very positive among all groups. Questions in this category, there were the most number of questions in this category overall, and it included information on the athletic mission and goals, policies and procedures, sports offerings, and the positive experience for athletes. So now I'm going to go into some individual questions in the programming category. The first is that the athletic mission reflects the values of the school and community. So there was very little disagreement to this statement, although there was some neutrality. So I think one thing that we will focus on is really making sure everyone knows the mission and what that is. The next is that participation in high school athletics is a positive experience. And since I haven't mentioned it, it is on the bottom, the key, but coaches are the darkest red, then parents, then students, if you go across. So there was very strong agreement for this as well. Mostly, the coaches had 70% strongly agree to that participation was positive. Parents were 50% and students were 30%. But when you add those strongly agree and agree columns, they're very positive. So that's really good to see. The next is that rules of conduct listed in the athletic handbook are effectively followed. Again, very strong agreement overall to this statement. And then in general, athletic policies and procedures are clearly defined and effective. So same trend that we're seeing throughout the programming slides. An appropriate balance exists between athletics and academics. So again, we had stronger agreement here. A little bit more neutrality from parents. But I do think that we have promoted this ideal with our athletics program, that really they're student athletes, the student comes first. One question that stood out from the programming category was the athletic program is well administered. I think when you compare the graphs, you can see there's a little bit more disagreement here, and for all groups, though it is still significantly positive. We discussed this question as an athletics committee and feel that it reflects directly on the structure of our athletic coordinator position, because it is a part-time position and stipended and can be difficult to maintain all the requirements needed to run the program. So that's the programming category. The next category was personnel, which is specific to coaches. Questions in this category focused on fairness, positivity, competence, and relationships. In this category, we also saw a very positive response. And from the responses, it's clear that all groups have a positive view of our coaching staff. The first question I wanted to highlight was, coaches are generally fair in choosing teams and playing athletes. And you'll see that this question was not included on the coaching survey, but was included in the parent and student survey. So that's why there's no bar for coaches in this question. And you can see that there is strong agreement. 45% of parents are in the agree column, and students, again, if you add the two columns, are around 70%, 60 to 70%. But there is some disagreement there. And so although it's not, it's about 15% for students, a little lower for parents, it's something that we might want to review as we do our self-study committee and how those teams are chosen. And then coaches teach positive values to athletes as well. So again, that question was not on the coaching survey, but was on the parents and student survey, and there was more agreement in this question than the previous. The next category is communication, which included questions on promoting athletics, expectations, media coverage, administrative communication, and coach communication. We had a positive response to this category as well, and there was very little disagreement among all groups. This question did have some disagreement, which was coach, parent, student. So depending on the group, coaches, for the coaching survey, it asked if coaches' input was valued, parent asked for parents, and student asked for student. And so there was mostly neutral responses here, and equal responses, more equal responses in the disagree and agree areas, if you add those together. So that's something to consider as we move forward with our committee process. This I wanted to highlight because it says the athletic department articulates its expectations regarding sportsmanship and proper fan behavior. And this had been a concern raised by board members during our athletics committee. And it's clear from the responses of the survey that all groups had strong agreement that expectations are articulated to different groups. And this question asks if coaches are effectively communicate their expectations. Again, we see a lot of agreement to that statement. And this question was only asked to parents, and it asked about communication between booster clubs and the athletic department leadership and school administration is effective. So neutral to agree for the most part, but we did also, in response to some questions that had come up, have Mike and Jeff did just recently meet with all booster club presidents to discuss some of these policies and procedures, and have already worked on improving those relationships. The next section is equity. which did show a higher level of disagreement than the other areas that we've discussed so far, specifically among parents and students. This will be an area of review for the self-study committee. And I will go over a couple of questions, but we do have a number of procedures and documents relating specifically to equity, including facility usage, provision of uniforms, and opportunity to play. And also through the recent Title IX reviews, we know that our program is equitable between genders. So we want to focus on how best to promote and communicate this value. So the first question that I'll go over is all students are given an equal opportunity to participate in athletic programs. And there was relatively strong agreement in all groups, especially from coaches, but also from parents and students that there is equal opportunity to play. And then the last category was financial support. And this was the most, the category where there was the most disagreement of all 5 categories. The questions in this category included equipment, uniforms, booster clubs, and facilities, and we'll go over those in the next slides. This question asks if our athletic teams are financially as well supported as those of our opponents. And so parents and students really tended to be on the disagreement side, as well as coaches, although there are, still significant numbers of all groups that agree that they're financially supported. But again, I think if you compare these to the other questions that we've reviewed, there's more disagreement than we've seen in the other questions. Then we got into more specifics. This specific question, which received the most disagreement of any question in the survey, was related to facilities. And it asks, athletic facilities are as good as those of our opponents. And if you look at the strongly agree all the way on the right, that is by far the most responses were in the strongly disagree and disagree categories. And so that's something that's a concern. And we recognize this as an area of need. And I think that's why we've completed that Fields and Grounds review last year in relation to the concern. The next question asks about athletic equipment. Is it as good as those of our opponents? And so there was certainly less disagreement than the facilities here, but you can see that there's disagreement and agreement on both sides. So it kind of trends down from the neutral in the middle. And then the last individual question that I'll highlight this evening is the athletic department has clearly defined guidelines for booster clubs. And again, this was only in the parent survey, but you can see that for the most part, the responses were in the neutral to disagree range. So our next steps will be to survey our JW parent community as well as youth sports programs, and then really work with our athletics committee and self-study team to review the remaining self-study components, which includes looking at a lot of our documents and policies and procedures and discussing strengths, weaknesses, and recommendations. And so we'll develop some recommendations based on our complete review of our athletics department. So that's all I have.
Thank you. That was great. And looks like Lon's hand is up. Lon.
Just a question. Anything surprise you on the survey?
Oh, yes, the hard questions, Lon.
I'm just curious if there's anything that stood out.
I think the surprise for me was that, when I did highlight the athletic expectations being effectively communicated, I think there had been a perception that, maybe spectators might not be following our athletic guidelines and our Class Act schools and all of that. But for the most part, people did agree that our expectations were clear. So maybe that was a surprise in a positive way.
Great, thank you.
Anybody else? Any questions? Anything? I have a question. So when you finish sort of organizing everything and surveying and so on and so forth, and you present the board or recommendations, will you sort of have priorities? Will it be similar to the way we see things come, for repairs, things like that, with prioritized lists, or how will we organize?
Yeah, I think so. And so we're actually looking at a number of different aspects of not only our program, but learning about how it compares with others. And so just as it has been in the past couple of years, I do anticipate during our budget development workshops, we are going to pull out athletics as a separate topic of conversation. To Carolyn's point about the self-study team, we're essentially adopting a CIAC rubric and engaging a panel of multi-stakeholders to really go further in depth with some of these topics. We're also going to be surveying our Rising Valley students at JW and also some of our community-based sports leagues to get additional insight and input. So once we gather all of that, it is going to translate into some prioritized area of needs. And I definitely anticipate some budgetary requests tied to athletics based on all the various data that we've collected.
Rick.
I just had a question. What's the timeline for completing those recommendations and coming up with sort of the budgetary considerations? Because I mean, we're soon into the season of budgeting, and if we get these in April, then it's really going to be too late to consider them for this coming year.
Right. So, we can't tackle it all at once, to be fair. I think we're going to have to, as a team, decide what are the most immediate priorities from our perspective administratively for the board's consideration. Certainly, I want to be clear, we're separating out, or maybe I should have said that first, we're separating out the athletic facilities conversation from our operational budget conversations. And so I do anticipate some operational budget discussions based on this feedback. The much larger portion of this conversation, of course, is around facilities and grounds. And so as we've discussed in the past, that'll be a separate conversation because you're looking at potentially some very large expenses when you start talking about things like tennis courts and track repair and field restoration. So that much larger conversation about facilities and grounds is going to be part of a larger bonding conversation that we will talk about in the spring. And so to be clear, when we talk about athletic program need, we're really thinking about some of the lesser expensive items that we feel can be in the program. We'll have that information ready for budget workshops. The larger discussion about facilities and grounds will take place this spring.
But I think we did have some facilities and grounds issues in our current capital plan that we developed over the last 2 years that we were looking to tackle, in a budgetary fashion as opposed to a bonding fashion. That we should consider those too. Safety issues, besides sidewalks in front of the school, but looking at some of those field issues that might be safety issues.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, I really appreciate that, Rick. And I think that'll be great conversation for the board when we get further into budget development. I do anticipate, to your point, that a lot of that conversation will really consist of looking at projects that we feel belong in some kind of a capital plan for operational budgeting purposes versus some of those larger items that'll likely fall into a broader conversation about bonding. And so I do look forward to having that conversation, and that'll definitely be a big part of our work ahead in the next few months.
And I see Lal and then Alex.
Yeah, I was glad to hear that, Brian. But I suspect that in the survey, there are really two categories there. There's the whole issue of policies and procedures, which they themselves can be addressed with probably not too much of an impact on budgetary constraints. I mean, that's how you communicate things. The contact between booster clubs and administration, all of those kinds of things could be solved at a relatively low cost. Then you've got the other issue of equipment and facilities. And like Rick just said, some of those go way, way beyond operating costs. You cannot Band-Aid the athletic facilities anymore. And so I think that there's that consideration. So, it may have somewhat of a budget impact for 22, 23, but I suspect that this is much more of a long range issue for the district. And in speaking to that, you're going to be doing a facilities survey. That also is going to have probably an impact. So has much thought been given to how all of this might dovetail? I'm sure it has, but in terms of how that gets out, and how you go about making a list of priorities between healthy airflow and a safe pitch so that kids are not getting hurt every week. So those are the kinds of things I think are really big considerations that the board and the administration are going to have to make over the next year.
Really appreciate that, Lal, and really all of it. So just to respond very quickly, because again, this will be a much larger topic of discussion for us over the next year or so. So part of the intention of waiting until the spring to talk more about the larger athletic facilities requests or recommendations, it will be in the context of also looking at the outcomes of that building study. And so what we are intending to do this spring is not only engaging our boards of education, but really engaging our towns in a presentation of the findings of the building study that is yet to be completed, along with the recommendations that came from the facilities and athletic grounds review. And so understanding our current debt service and understanding really the parameters that we should be thinking about in terms of bonding, we hope to present that information and then look at both the building study and the athletic ground study in totality. So to your point, we can really understand priorities on both fronts and come up with not only a comprehensive approach, but a sensible approach to addressing needs. On the operational side, I do agree, and I think you raised some good points about things like Booster Club outreach. I know we didn't talk about that at length this evening. We just had a really great meeting, and kudos to Mike and his team, meeting with our booster clubs to improve some of those areas. In terms of budgeting theme, I think really looking at equipment needs, and I do anticipate revisiting the conversation about the administrative structure for the athletic program based on this feedback is something that I would anticipate would be a budget theme. This was something that we had some brief discussion about last year during budget without some of the information that we were able to bring forward tonight. And so one of the conversations that the athletic committee had in response to this survey data was thinking about different concepts to improve the oversight and leadership of the program, given the limitations of our current model. And so from an operational standpoint, that will be a budget theme that I anticipate discussing with the board in the next month or so. So I'll leave it there for now. But again, I really appreciate your comments.
Alex?
Thanks, Kate. I was just wondering if respondents had the ability to provide written feedback if they chose to say strongly disagree or disagree.
Carolyn, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, there was a comment section after each category, as well as a general comment section at the end of the survey. And that comment section asked what was the strongest aspect of the athletic department, what would they most like to see changed, and general feedback. So we do have a lot of comments from the survey as well.
Would that be disseminated in another way? Did I miss that slide? I'm sorry.
No, we didn't include it on this slide, and I'm not sure that we would disseminate that information at this time. There's a lot of very candid feedback, which is very helpful to us administratively, but it's not necessarily in a format that we would be inclined to share publicly. We would have to think of a way to capture some of that feedback thematically. But what I would offer is that for any board members wishing to sort of view that feedback as is, we can certainly make that available.
No, high level, just so we understand where the 10% we're coming from would be helpful.
Absolutely, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I would just like to add one more thing. From a perspective of again, that long range thinking, it's going to be crucial, I think, to develop some sort of a communication plan as you move forward. Region 8 just turned down an athletics facilities bond in all 3 towns. And if you're dealing with a group of constituents of 30% have kids in school, and of that 30%, 40% of them are involved in athletics. that's a very small number of constituents that you're reaching out to. And while it might be a quality of life or safety issue, a health issue, it's going to take a lot of work to convince a community to sink X millions into, complete renovation or redesign or whatever you want to, wherever it ends up into a plan. So I think that as the committee, as this school athletics committee goes forward, I think one component that you really have to think about is how are you going to communicate the data that you're finding and your plans to the larger community. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura.
And John, Zach.
Yeah. So this is more of an observation. I think one thing that still needs to be, I guess, thought about is that the survey did not hit on, I suppose, why the committee or why the board's been asking questions and whatnot. And I'll just jump to it. And that is the large amount of time that administration spends working on these matters, right? So the survey seems to say that there's sort of a neutral feeling as far as all the various things that, Brian, you and your team have had to work with, right? But the bottom line to it is that, if you were to rack up do a Pareto of where you spend your time, I think that if I were to do that and then compare that to the survey, there's a disconnect there somewhere, right? So I think in how you approach the data, you still have some fundamental issues there. And I think you've hit on it, right? Some of these things, maybe an athletics director or however you go about this. But there's clearly something there that needs to be worked on and how it gets worked on. So it's just an observation about the data you got in does not match up with a certain set of realities that we all know to be true. So either the data isn't hitting at the right things or something's being missed because of what the clear observation is you've been living it. So I don't want to throw a hot potato into the room, but it's a real observation and one that from an efficiency point of view of where you all spend your time, you're very there's a lot of work and you spend a lot of energy. So as a board, we're obviously concerned about that, right? So I'll leave it there.
Well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate that sensitivity and the consideration to the efforts of not only myself, but really the whole team in trying to make sure that we're supporting our program. One of the ways that we may be able to get at that, and you're definitely giving me some food for thought, as we go further with the self-study process, the team that we're going to be engaging at the high school, we have one set of data from the survey, but I think we probably have the ability to go further with some of those areas of concern, maybe a little bit differently with the multi-stakeholder group. We can think about the types of questions and tasks that we engage that group in. And so where the survey may fall short of some of that, I do think we'll have an opportunity to take a second crack at it through that self-study process. And so I do appreciate that feedback, and that's something that the committee will certainly discuss before going further with that self-study. So I appreciate that.
And Rick.
And no more questions, but I just want to say I appreciate the level of information that you've had on this topic and on the previous one, that we're able to have this discussion in the board meeting without generating more questions than being able to actually answer a lot of the concerns. So I think it's a great step in the right direction.
Thank you, Rick. And really thank you to Mike and Carolyn, as well as all the staff from Valley this evening that participated in those presentations. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It was very, very comprehensive and very clear. The delivery was great. It was really nice to get that information. And I feel that, it benefits not only the kids and our program, but our communities as well, because I don't know if this is as much the case during the pandemic, but often we'll see people walk on the track or hit a ball on the tennis course or, come use the facilities and enjoy them. So it's nice for everyone to keep them up and provide support for them. And I would argue and have argued it ties into social emotional learning. It's a good way for kids to stay balanced in difficult times. So anyway, Lori Ann, please.
Real quick, as you're doing this self-study, I would like you to look at, not that I need to know, but I think part of this is also of those who responded, what sports were they involved in? Because one of the things that we're looking at is costs. And did the parents and students of the ones that have the least amount of kids involved, did they even respond to the survey, or was it the larger groups that did? So that's something that I think you should also keep into consideration as you're looking at who responded to the survey and who did not, and what potential reasons for that is.
Carolyn, do you want to quickly respond to that? Because we do have some of that data.
I do have that information. It's a large number. We have a large number of sports, and they were really across the board. So I hesitate to list out all of the sports and how many respondents there were for each, but we can certainly provide that information and review it as part of the self-study team.
Yeah, I don't need the answers. It's just part of the cost analysis with the sports and what we're spending, especially when it's with other schools and of interest and busing and everything. Okay, thank you. I'm glad to hear that it was part of it. Excellent.
I just want to thank you for making the effort here. It's actually very helpful, I think, for our budgetary discussions coming up, especially for the short-term issues that we can address. And I know that the community's been eager to give feedback, so to be able to do so in a way that I think really delineates all of the different areas of concern that I've heard has been really helpful for me to see that response and see which stakeholders feel a certain way on certain things. So thank you for all the effort here.
Is there a platform that's going to present this information to the public that completed the surveys?
Well,
so that they know what the results were?
Sure. So I think our thought was this was it. This is a recorded meeting. It'll be available on the website. That's something we can certainly talk more about with the athletics committee if there's other platforms or venues to get this information out to the community. Certainly when we get into more of those longer range facilities discussions where we're talking about the condition of fields and facilities, we absolutely anticipate that'll be a much larger community conversation by design. We will be coming back to this topic periodically throughout the year as this was a focus area that we identified. And so certainly once the self-study team completes their work, I do anticipate coming back to this board with a similar presentation just to provide updated info.